If you've ever asked someone their opinion on the M551 Sheridan, it's usually pretty negative, or at best, mediocre. Today, I'll be covering the Vietnam War combat history of the Sheridan to see if it truly deserves the hate that it gets. Before we get to the combat of the M551 in Vietnam, we must understand the tank and why it came to be. In January of 1959, preliminary concept studies were initiated to characterize a new light combat vehicle, designated as an Armored Reconnaissance Airborne Assault Vehicle, AR-AAV. The AR-AAV was supposed to be a truly airborne light tank, and hopefully be more successful than prior vehicles. This platform needed to have air deployability, amphibious capabilities, improved firepower compared to earlier platforms, namely the M41 and M56, and maximum protection without sacrificing the other requirements. Interestingly, this would be the first U.S. tank designed to be inherently amphibious. These characteristics were set at a conference at the Ordnance Tank Automotive Command in July of 1959. By December of that year, a contract was signed with the Cadillac Motor Car Division for the further development of this concept, which was now designated as AR-AAV XM551. The first XM551 was delivered in June of 1962. Over the next 3 years, the program underwent extensive training and further development, and by February of 1965, the final XM551, pilot number 12, had been constructed. The XM551 would be standardized as the 152mm gun launcher AR-AAV M551 Sheridan. On April 12th of 1965, a contract would be awarded with the Allison Division of General Motors Corporation to produce the M551 at the Cleveland Army Tank Automotive Plant. The hull of the Sheridan is constructed from 7039 aluminum alloy, surrounded by flotation cells filled with polystyrene foam, while the turret of the Sheridan is constructed from both cast and rolled homogeneous steel. This will give the Sheridan about half an inch to an inch of armor at most. You can get a pretty good idea of how thin this is by simply knocking on the Sheridan. The M551 is powered by the General Motors 6V53T, a 6-cylinder, 2-cycle supercharged diesel engine. This displaces 318.4 cubic inches and provides a total of 300 gross horsepower at 2,800 RPM. Coupled with this engine is the XTG 250 1A transmission. This gives the Sheridan 4 forward and 2 reverse gears. The power pack of the Sheridan allowed it to traverse up to 43 miles per hour on level road and 3.6 miles per hour in water. With 150 gallons of fuel, it could travel approximately 350 miles. The torsion bar suspension system, with 5 road wheels per side, gave the Sheridan a total ground pressure of 6.8 psi. The Sheridan could climb grades up to 60%, cross trenches 8 feet wide, and climb walls 33 inches in height. The most interesting part of the Sheridan was its firepower. The M551 utilized a radically new main armament system, the 152mm gun launcher M81. The M81 is capable of firing both conventional ammunition and the barrel-fired shillelagh anti-tank guided missile, allowing it to destroy tanks, fortifications, and infantry positions. In total, 1,662 M551 Sheridans were produced from 1966 to 1970. The program, including the cost of the vehicles, ammunition, and equipment, would exceed $1.3 billion. With such a hefty price tag, you'd expect the Sheridan to be a near-perfect vehicle. That is far from the truth. The M551 Sheridan had multiple issues from the start. One of the largest was its gun launcher and ammunition. The Sheridan used combustible case ammunition. To put in simple terms, the casing of the ammunition would burn off inside the breech when fired. But if that casing did not completely burn off, and if it left any residue on the inside of the breech, it could lead to serious issues. One government report found, quote, out of the 509 attempts to ignite the ammunition, we had 7 that actually ignited prior to the time the breech block functioned. During an Army armor review, Congressman Samuel S. Stratton would go as far as to say, quote, we have been over time and time again, as I am sure you recall having sat through these sessions, pointing out that one of the main reasons for putting the Sheridan into Standard 8 production back in May of 1966 was because if it had remained in limited production, the eagles of the Bureau of the Budget and the Department of Defense would have been on your necks. So the decision to proceed with the vehicle was actually made in an effort to avoid or circumvent or flout the established management rules of the Pentagon itself. In 1969, the Government Accountability Office uncovered that the Army had rushed the program to avoid budgetary scrutiny. Lawmakers openly criticized Army officials for concealing cost figures and bumbling ineptness. Keep this in mind for later on. Now that we understand some of the basics of the Sheridan, let's get to its combat history in Vietnam. Shortly after the Sheridan entered service in mid-1966, there were proposals by the Army staff in DC to deploy the Sheridan to Southeast Asia. U.S. cavalry units there were facing an issue. Vehicles such as the M113 Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle were light and mobile enough to push through jungle terrain, but lacked sufficient firepower to deal with the fortifications. And the platform that did have enough firepower, the M48A3, was considerably heavier and couldn't maneuver through the terrain as easily. The M551 seemed like the perfect solution, the best of both worlds. It had similar maneuverability to the M113 while carrying heavy firepower than the M48. However, then commander of the U.S. forces in South Vietnam, General Westmoreland, was opposed to the Sheridan being deployed. Ammunition for the gun had yet to enter full-scale production. Problems with the combustible ammunition slowed production, and only enough ammunition was produced to meet training requirements. Because main gun ammunition was not available, General Westmoreland said that the Sheridan would function as a $300,000 machine gun platform. In 1968, the ammunition issues were partially resolved, and the Sheridan was brought up to Westmoreland's successor, General Creighton Abrams. As General Abrams prepared to equip cavalry units in Vietnam with the Sheridan, he would receive some concerns from the soon-to-be afflicted crews. Many of them would voice their concerns over the Sheridan's armor, or lack thereof. In December of 1968, General Abrams visited Vietnam and met with Colonel George S. Patton IV, the commander of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, ACR. During this meeting, General Abrams brought up the concerns for the M551. Colonel Patton suggested that instead of reorganizing all cavalry units with the Sheridan, that it should be combat tested by a divisional cavalry squadron as well as a squadron from his own regiment, since the two squadrons had completely different missions. This would allow the Sheridan to be tested in a range of scenarios. This 90-day combat trial fell under the Army Concept Team in Vietnam, ACT-IV. This evaluation was to first assess the combat suitability of the M551 Sheridan, 2. Measure maintenance and logistical demands under field conditions, and 3. Compare the M551's value against the M48A3 and M113. Thus, 3rd Squadron 4th Cavalry, or 3/4 Cav, and 1st Squadron 11th ACR were selected to combat test the M551 Sheridan. And by January of 1969, 64 Sheridans would be sent to Vietnam. The 3/4 Cav exchanged their M48A3 patents for the M551 Sheridan at a 1-for-1 rate, while the 11th ACR replaced every 2 ACAVs for 3 Sheridans. As the Sheridans were being deployed to South Vietnam, they'd quickly find themselves in the mini-Tet, or the lesser-known Tet attacks of 1969. On the 23rd of February 1969, the Viet Cong launched a coordinated assault on Bien Hoa. Around 2 a.m., elements of the Viet Cong's 5th Division's 274th Regiment opened fire with rockets and mortars, striking ammunition storage areas, fuel points, and barracks across the base. Their plan was to follow the bombardment with sapper and infantry assaults to overrun portions of the perimeter and cripple the base. The 11th ACR stationed at Bien Hoa were equipped with a mix of M113 ACAVs and the newly issued M551 Sheridans. The squadron, named Task Force Privet for their commander, Major William C. Privet, moved rapidly to intercept the enemy forces massing south of the post. The cavalrymen pushed through along Highway 15, where they made contact with several hundred Viet Cong fighters attempting to advance under the cover of darkness. The Sheridans proved indispensable. One of the most devastating ammunition types for the Sheridan was M625 Canister. This anti-personnel round carries 10,000 13-grain steel flechettes. With a maximum effective range of 400 yards, it would prove devastating in close quarters. The 11th ACR, with the support of helicopter gunships and infantry, would inflict heavy casualties on the VC. Some reports even state that in the face of the firepower, many Viet Cong panicked and retreated. By late afternoon, the combined forces of the 11th ACR, alongside various infantry and aviation support, had crushed the main attack. More than 80 enemy soldiers were killed near the base's perimeter. Follow-up sweeps over the next 48 hours found weapon caches, bunkers, and the remains of the dispersed 274th Regiment. The Sheridan would excel in defeating infantry. According to a 1969 review of Army tank program, quote, as of the 8th of March, a total of 168 killed in action and 11 prisoners of war have been credited to the Sheridan's equipped cavalry troops. The Sheridan was vital for the defense of Bien Hoa. If we were to only look at this battle, it seems as if the Sheridan is perfect, but that's not quite the case, and especially not for the 3/4 Cav. On February 15th, the 3/4 Cav would be patrolling outside of Cu Chi, just northwest of Saigon. This was a routine patrol. The only difference was they were now utilizing the Sheridans instead of the Patton tank. One of these Sheridans would set off a 25-pound pressure mine. This explosion would rupture the Sheridan's hull, hit the 152mm ammunition, and ignite the ammo. This would trigger a second explosion that destroyed the tank. Sheridan crews became increasingly uneasy because of this. They knew that a similar explosion under an M48A3 would have simply blown off a few road wheels and damaged the track, not destroy the tank completely due to a catastrophic explosion. Later that year, 3 more Sheridans were destroyed during a river crossing when a mine went off, and in March of 1971, the 11th ACR lost 5 Sheridans in one day, all due to RPG fire. The very issue that many crews were wary of was starting to become a nightmare. Due to the lackluster armor, many Sheridan crews began to adopt add-on armor, many of which were field modifications. A common modification was belly armor. The front third of the Sheridan's undercarriage would have a metal plate welded to it. This typically consisted of sheet metal 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch thick. This would protect the front end of the vehicle if it hit a mine, and it did help. According to one government report, quote, the belly armor applique is credited with saving numerous casualties which would have otherwise resulted from enemy mines. However, by adding approximately 1,500 pounds of armor to the front of the tank, it would lead to some issues. Because the additional weight was consolidated to the front of the tank, it would wear down the front suspension quicker. Additionally, the extra weight would lower the Sheridan's mobility. Another form of armor, one that we can see on the Sheridan behind me, is this chain link fence. While this may not seem like the strongest of materials, it would significantly help. The fence could catch RPGs or other similar warheads, or prematurely detonate them, lowering the effectiveness of the shaped charge. These two units had very different reactions from one another. Why? Well, there's a few possible contributing factors. One of the biggest was their approach to training and the trade-offs for the Sheridan. The 3/4 Cav had elected not to stand down an entire troop for transition. As a result, key leaders were often absent from briefings and trainings. And as mentioned earlier, the 3/4 Cav had traded their M48s for Sheridans at a 1-for-1 rate, trading their much more heavily armored vehicle for a platform that had similar protection to the M113. By comparison, the 11th ACR had given an entire troop 7 days of uninterrupted training, and their trade-offs were much more favorable. They traded in 2 of their A-Cavs for 3 Sheridans. The 3/4 Cav would continue to question the effectiveness of the Sheridan, but it would have some redemption in the eyes of the 3/4 Cav on March 10th of 1969. On that night, a listening post just outside of Tay Ninh City reported enemy troop movement. The 3/4 Cav moved Sheridans into the area, where they utilized night observation devices to scan the area. As VC troops were spotted, the Sheridans would fire canister shots into their ranks. The sheer volume of fire would cause the enemy's ranks to break and retreat. The next morning, more than 40 enemy dead, including a battalion and company commander, were found on the battlefield. Following the 90-day combat trial, it was found that the Sheridan had greater mobility, firepower, and night fighting capabilities than the vehicles they replaced. On the strength of this conclusion, 200 Sheridans would be sent to Vietnam by 1970. Nearly every cavalry unit in Vietnam would be equipped with the Sheridan. Sheridan served in multiple areas during this conflict, not just Vietnam, but also Cambodia. In May of 1970, American and ARVN troops would push across the border and invade Cambodia. While Cambodia was a neutral country, the eastern side of the country would be utilized extensively by PAVN and Viet Cong forces. The PAVN used wide stretches of sparsely populated eastern Cambodia as sanctuaries, places to withdraw from South Vietnam, rest, and reorganize without risk of attack. These base areas also served as logistical hubs for PAVN and VC, storing weapons and other material. The American and South Vietnamese invasion aimed at destroying these resources and routing the enemy from these sectors. At dawn on the 1st of May 1970, two columns of tanks and armored personnel carriers of the 11th ACR crunched towards the Cambodian border from Tay Ninh province. As one senior U.S. official told the newsman, quote, "This Cambodia operation is pure blitzkrieg, something from a World War II Panzer Division's book of tactics." This Cambodian blitz was proof that tanks could be adapted for warfare in Southeast Asia. The resistance was stiff. The enemy was dug in, well-concealed, heavily fortified positions. As Colonel Don A. Starry, commander of the 11th ACR, would recall, quote, "The enemy troops we've encountered here have been heavily entrenched in some of the best bunkers we've seen." Despite these heavy fortifications, Sheridans would be utilized to overrun and methodically destroy the bunkers. Following operations in Cambodia, the Sheridan's role will shift. It went from search and destroy operations to a more defensive role: sector security, border patrols, night ambushes, route clearances, and etc. The M551 continued to be utilized throughout Vietnam in 1971 and 1972, in areas such as Ho Bo, Bin Durong, and Due Canyon, amongst other areas. As the Vietnam War started to come to a close, Sheridans began to be pulled from Vietnam. The final Sheridans left in April of 1972. So where does that leave us? What does this say about the Sheridan's legacy? There is certainly good in the story, but there's also a lot of bad. As I've brought up throughout the entire story, the Sheridan's armor would always be a significant issue. While measures were created to help this problem, such as the implementation of add-on armor, it was simply putting a band-aid over a bullet wound. Out of the 200 Sheridans that were sent to Vietnam, more than 100 would be lost in action. By comparison, we lost around 100 M48 out of the near 600 the US sent over. If the hull of the Sheridan were breached by one of these weapons, it could set off the ammunition. The Sheridan's conventional rounds used a combustible case that burned away at firing rather than extracting like a brass case. When a mine blast or shape-charged jet breached the hull or turret, hot fragments and flame could set off the stowed propellant. This was not the only issue with the ammunition. The case of the Sheridan's ammunition could swell with excess moisture and could easily tear if handled roughly. And as we've talked about at the beginning of the video, any smoldering residue left over could prematurely set off one of these rounds. While there were changes to mitigate this problem, it was never truly solved. The best solution was have the loader inspect the inside of the breech after firing to make sure that there was no leftover residue. Even though the Sheridan sent to Vietnam lacked the Shillelagh anti-tank guided missile, it retained much of the same equipment as they were needed for electronics, stabilization, and other systems. The heat and humidity wreaked havoc on these systems. The engine of the Sheridan, the 6V53T, struggled and performed poorly in Vietnam. Faults such as broken RPM limiters and overheating were common issues. The engine's supercharger was also extremely noisy, and when accelerating, a rooster tail of exhaust smoke would shoot up, meaning the Sheridan was easily spotted and identified. By May of 1969, only a few months after the Sheridan entered the country, records listed 16 major mechanical failures, 181 defective or failed rounds, 25 engine burnouts, over 100 issues with internal electronics, alongside dozens of other issues. Aside from mechanical issues, the Sheridan was never truly used in Vietnam for its original purpose. Remember, the Sheridan is classified as an AR-AAV, Armored Reconnaissance Airborne Assault Vehicle. While it was utilized in a reconnaissance and force role, it was never air deployed in Vietnam, and air deployability was a major reason as to why the Sheridan was designed. There were many problems with the Sheridan, but do the pros outweigh the cons? The Sheridan was pushed into service with a plethora of issues. Many of those issues would follow the Sheridan into combat during the Vietnam War. However, it would prove itself as an incredible asset. When the Sheridan did work, it worked well. The only issue is that the days it did work were far and few between. While it did have its issues, I believe that the Sheridan is truly overhated. But I will leave it up to you to form your own opinion.